What I'm to speak about today, declaredly, is about sadness, the pain of sadness just a bit, and the value of sadness, and the joy in sadness. Yes, you did hear that right, the joy in sadness. Because while sadness is painful and infused with accompanying feelings of loneliness and despair, sadness can also be infused with joy. We can be joyful and sad at the same time. So while today's address is declaredly about sadness, the themes behind the theme are embracing contradictions, holding opposites gently, and living within the shifting dance of paradox. It is all right to be sad. It really is. When I speak about sadness, I sometimes refer to it as depression. Many doctors, psychiatrists, and psychologists say that sadness and depression are two completely different emotional states. They say that sadness is a normal emotion, that if we allow it to run its course, is good for us. Depression, on the other hand, is an abnormal state that is qualitatively different from sadness. It is a kind of frozen sadness, a sadness that has not allowed itself to be expressed. Other clinicians, however, and this is a more recent and very respected opinion, say that sadness and depression are the same emotion. They are just on a continuum. That depression is just sadness in extremis, and that we can move from sadness to depression and back again quite frequently. I've always identified with the first position, but I'm increasingly beginning to identify more with the second. The contemporary philosopher and Jungian therapist Thomas More speaks of sadness and depression as the same thing. He explores them with reference to civilizations of the past. He suggests that when people of the Renaissance and the Middle Ages referred to the depressed state as being in Saturn, they were suggesting that depression is a quality of life and things. A tree may look depressed, or an animal, a building too, could look depressed. Perhaps, he says, depression is not the best word to describe this Saturnine side of life because it has come to sound rather clinical, as if it is something we have, like the measles, rather than a spirit like Saturn pressing down on us and keeping us still. We live in a be happy society. We take it as self-evident that to strive for happiness is normal for people and that it should be one of our primary goals. Ask any Western parent what they want for their child in life and they will nearly always say, "I just want her to be happy." And we all think this is quite a reasonable thing to say, don't we? We would even feel something was a little bit strange if they didn't reply with that rather well-trodden phrase. But does everyone in the world feel like this? No, they don't. The Hawaiian psychologist Aaron Ajiva says that personal happiness is just one of the many possible goals that may underline human action. Cross-cultural research shows that valuing personal and individualistic happiness in life is strong in the affluent societies of the West, but that honouring parents, elders and ancestors, and being seen as calm, modest, sharing, contributing members of the social group is stronger in collectivists or connection-oriented cultures. We need to step back sometimes and reflect on what may be our Western-biased mind, the accepted normalcy of self-happiness, and consider whether it is really the most effective or the only way to achieve a life of heft and integrity. The Guardian newspaper in Britain had a columnist for several years called Nick Johnston. Nick's column was titled Blue Notes, and it was a weekly exploration of his life with chronic depression. Nick took medication and attended weekly therapy sessions. He wrote about the pain of depression, the woeful inadequacies of the healthcare system on offer, and the incompetence of many clinicians. He wrote about the ignorance of friends and family and the general public surrounding anything to do with mental illness. And he spoke about the frequent sense of despair and anger that arose within him as a result of his depression. It was quite depressing to read. But I remember one week vividly. He wrote on what he described as the paradox in depression, that while he could be deeply depressed sometimes, he could also be deeply contented, infused with deep gratitude for anything that was good in his life and the world generally. He said he could feel sadness and joy deeply at the same time, and that while he could feel the weight of depression and the sinking pool of sadness, he could often at the same time feel the light beckoning of joy and gratitude and experience visitations of grace. They were all there together simultaneously, the light, the dark, and the in-between. When I read that column, after all the others, I chimed a resounding yes. I was living in London at the time and experiencing a deep sense of sadness and quite an acute bout of depression after the birth of one of my children. And I was so familiar with that sinking feeling of despair in the pit of my stomach, the leaden feeling of exhaustion, where just deciding whether or not to walk the dog around the block would take 3 hours. And I remember that intense self-focus, when all that seemed to matter was how I felt, hour by hour. The rest of the world was insignificant. And I remember unloading the dishwasher one morning when the newsreader on the radio announced the first British casualties in the war in Iraq. And I remember thinking, I should be really upset by this and really shocked, but I'm not. I just don't care. All I can think about is the lead in my feet and the ever-sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. But there were also days, and sometimes they were the same days, when my feet were leaden and my stomach was seeking, but at the same time, I felt a deep sense of contentment, as though I had been visited by grace. It was during these times that I gained some, if not all, of my deepest spiritual insights, the ones that I try to share with you each week. And it was during these times that my senses were most keenly awakened. I can tell you in great detail the colour of the autumn leaves on my daily walk, the taste of the tom yum soup I had for lunch at the local Chinese cafe every day at 2 p.m. The chef made it for me and called it tom yum soup for the soul. I can describe to you the late afternoon autumn sun on the wall of the bakery across the street from the cafe. I could recite to you the kind words of my GP, a counsellor, my health visitor, and especially the local pharmacist, who each guided me back to health and well-being. And I could describe to you the feel and texture of the wool and needles of the knitting that I did that soothed my frazzled nerves back to a place of calm. I cannot describe to you in any detail at all any of these things during times of happiness, of which there are many, try as hard as I might. Thomas More says that people often say there is no imagination in depression. It is a void, a dark pit, a cave with no exit. But he says, a portion of this suffering comes from our inability to give sadness a language and imagery. It feels vague and therefore without meaning. We don't know what to do with it because we don't know what it is. But if we could become better at articulating the imagery of sadness and despair, we might be that much closer to the meaning that would make it bearable. We may, he says, need a depressive aesthetics, an art of emptiness. When sadness visits us, Thomas More says, it makes us contemplate. It takes our thoughts deep and far, and the reasons our thoughts feel so heavy when we are sad is because they bear so much meaning, even if at the same time they might feel empty. Paradoxically, he says, emptiness is one of the heaviest ideas in religion and philosophy. I finished writing this sermon last Thursday, but last night, when we were driving back from the wedding where our children's nanny Kate was married to her American fiancé Omar, my eldest daughter Imogen, who is 6, said, "Mummy, when Kate and Omar were listening to the speeches and everyone was saying such nice things about them, why was Kate crying? And I began to explain what tears of joy were. And she said, oh, that explains it. When you were doing that ceremony, and you kept mentioning that word commitment, what does that mean, Mummy? But when you were doing that, everyone was smiling, and I couldn't stop smiling because I was so excited for Kate and Omar. But I thought I was going to burst into tears because I was really sad because she's going to leave and I'm never going to see her again. It was really weird. I was happy and sad at the same time.